the Center for Space Science and Technology Education in Asia and the Pacific, which is an UN affiliated center here, located in Dehradun, India. And through this center, we are doing large amount of capacity building activities in the Asia Pacific region. And every year we are organizing 10 months course on remote sensing and GIS, satellite meteorology, which is very important in terms of when we talk about floods. So we're also giving a course on satellite meteorology and global climate. We also do engage with our SAARC countries like India, Nepal, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, and Maldives under SAARC umbrella and organize short-term courses, which can be of the tune of 1 week to 2 weeks on very frequent interval, where the National Disaster Management Authority of India also takes strong participation. Recently, along with UNUSA, we also did a MOOC exercise this year. Because of the pandemic, we could not run our regular courses, so we decided to switch over to this global MOOC on disaster risk management, and it was very popular MOOC. I can tell you that more than 10,000 participants in different tracks of the MOOC, they got benefited across more than 100 countries in the world. And it got very nice outreach from our UNUSA, UN Spider office as well. As we are doing short-term courses for space technology for disaster management for ASEAN countries also. This is just a small brochure I am showing over here, where we are planning to do another course for the UN steep on the disaster risk management related thing. I will not go into the list of details of this list. It's available. These are the courses which we organized in the last couple of years, and many of them were in-campus courses, but now since last year, most of them has turned into virtual platforms. Next slide, please. Can we? Yeah. So, currently, if you see the focus of our work on as far as the flood, space-based flood mapping and monitoring examples are concerned, space technology we are using, for river reservoir level, water level estimation, and then catchment, floodplain condition assessment, and the different type of, satellite-derived parameters are being used, like soil moisture, altimeter observations for river water level estimation, river discharge estimation, reservoir level estimation. The list is very long, but what essentially we do at the time of the flood season, especially in India during monsoon, most part of eastern India frequently get flooded, and this is an example of a near real-time product which we could derive using synthetic aperture radar datasets of floods in Bihar in the last year in the month of July 2020. What you see in the light blue color is the flood inundated regions, and the dark blue colors are the natural water bodies which are available throughout the year. So this type of quick turnaround products are very useful. They are easily disseminated through our web portals to the ground staff as well as administrators and policymakers. And here you see an example when we invoked our charter, international charter, the high resolution data. You can see the flood inundation conditions where most of the houses in this locality were under flood. So this type of maps are very useful for research and rescue, and also providing rehabilitation and food and medical and water supports to the people, those who are stuck up in this type of flood situations. Next slide. Yeah, as far as the models, tools development and enhancing the flood resilience is concerned, we have developed recently a very interesting tool where we are using Google Earth Engine for flood mapping using Sentinel-1 and Sentinel-2 datasets. And then we also map the spatial extent, area, and then other geographical layers are associated with it. And immediately through this portal, these datasets are provided to the planners, and the outputs are generated in the form of charts, etc. We also have an operational flood forecast warning system called FLUS in northeast India, where the WRF, heavy rain forecasts are used for, next 24 hours for assessing the extreme rainfall events. And by combining this rainfall forecast with the hydrological models, where you are having data about the river catchment as well as river cross sections, flood forewarning is generated, and then it is disseminated through web portals as well as through mobile-based alert system to the ground authorities. Satellite altimetry is also being used for water level inundation mapping, as well as one of the most important product. Now we have more than 20 years of flood layers over different parts of the country available. So by combining this multi-year flood hazards, we are generating what we call as the flood hazard zonation maps for different states in the country, which essentially tells you about the degree of the risk a particular location has as far as the frequency of the floods is concerned. Next slide. Yeah, I was told to just briefly touch upon the recent, the flash flood event which happened in Himalaya in Uttarakhand region on 7th of February 2021. So a lot of theories were there in the beginning that a lot of people talked about a glacier outburst, lake causing this flood, but we invoked the International Disaster Charter that evening itself, and the next day onwards we started getting large amount of data, and then what we found is that this event was because of a landslide. You can see this area. Please focus over here. This is the Himalayan, region covered with snow covered, as well as in this area, this is the glacier, and this is the tributary of this glacier. So over this region, there was a landslide, and you can see that in a high resolution image, the difference is very clear. So this hanging mass over here, it basically got collapsed, and a huge landslide of the size of around 5 football grounds created this flash flood, and it has fallen around 2 kilometers from this height. So you can imagine such a huge mass, when it is falling around 2 kilometers, the amount of energy it will produce, and immediately it basically triggered the melting of the snow and the terminal moraine of this glacier, and a large amount of flash flood was seen in the downstream areas. In this image, you can see the marks of the flood, the flood line, and if you make measurements, the flood markings are going up to the mountains as high as 150 meters or so. So you can imagine 150 meters means a 50-storied building. So the water wave was as high as 50 meters building in this area where this landslide has happened, and triggered this huge deluge of water, which subsequently downstream, devastated this entire region, and more than two hydropower plants and more than 6 bridges, they got collapsed, and more than 200 people were found missing. During this process, a temporary lake was also formed, and this still has some danger in terms of breaching and then causing the similar kind of situation down the line in future also. But now I think there is a local level management is being done to open this particular artificial lake, which has been created by the sediments which is brought by this huge muck which got created due to this event. Next slide, please. So I will just show you, would like to keep, the discussions brief in terms of identifying the gaps and synergies. So what we feel is that simpler tools like hydrological modeling and hydraulic models and potential damage evaluation tools are needed for quick and faster flood risk assessment. Skilled personnel for running models and interpreting hydrological model outputs are required. Analysis ready and actionable products are required by the policymakers. Urban flooding is increasing every year, and there are different causes for urban flooding. I think this is another new important priority area in this part of the world. Early warning systems, especially in terms of having integrated systems making use of meteorological data sets as well as meteorological forecast and hydrological forecast, needs to be combined, and we need to train people to develop this type of integrated modeling systems. Of course, the impact of climate change on flood needs to be further investigated, as this has been highlighted by this recent Uttarakhand flood. And with this, I will come to my last slide, which is on practical next steps for capacity building. Is essentially we need now with the COVID, which has taught us importance about online learning, and I think in near time also it's going to be there. So we have to now move on to what we call the hybrid mode of learning. This has to be encouraged so that more number of people they can get benefited by the capacity building programs. Lesson learned from each flood event is very different. It's very unique, and best practices for sharing this data sets among the professionals needs to be emphasized further. And we can think of creating a regional or a global flood disaster dashboard where large amount of data can be accumulated, and others in different parts of the world can also learn from the experiences of certain individuals wherever these events are happening, because every event is very, very unique and it poses different type of challenges. As far as the role of our CIOS WGCapD is concerned, it can play a very effective role by bringing in together domain experts and the experts, those who are having expertise in developing capacity building tools and best practices to educate younger people for flood resilient society for the sustainable development. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prakash. It's a really dramatic situation there in Uttarakhand, and I'm sure that there'll be a lot of questions for you to follow up on that. So thanks so much for your presentation. I'm just going to switch to Guy to switch over the presentations, and then we'll hear from Juan Carlos next. So just bear with me 1 second. I'll get the presentation up. Okay, Juan Carlos from UN Spider, over to you.
Thank you very much, Erin, and thanks to the CIOS Working Group on Capacity Building and Development for this opportunity to present what we're doing at UN Spider in capacity building. Next slide, please. Of course, like many other organizations, we also carry out capacity building efforts. Part of our efforts are, of course, raising awareness about the use of space technologies in flood early warning systems, flood hazard assessment, and flood mapping, basically covering all areas of the disaster management cycle. We, of course, recognize that we need to use particular language, particular tools when it comes to decision makers, and different tools when it comes to users or to technical people. So there's no one size fits all. So we have to also tailor that part. Taking advantage of some of these cloud-based tools like Google Earth Engine and Jupyter Notebooks, we are developing some solutions for flood mapping, particularly because in some developing countries there's a very limited bandwidth, and that inhibits the capacity of countries to be downloading radar imagery, Sentinel-1 radar imagery, for example. So developing solutions on these cloud-based platforms is a way to help countries generate their own data on impacts of floods and so on. And of course, we carry out our efforts, but we do believe in sort of streamlining our solutions across countries using step-by-step procedures developed by our partners, our regional support offices. We call them recommended practices, using open software so that at least there can be some horizontal cooperation in neighboring countries on the use of these solutions. The next slide, please. Sorry for the long text. It's important for us, of course, to identify gaps like for any other organization. And one of the ways we do this is, of course, conducting technical advisory missions where we visit 10, 15 government agencies with a group of 8 to 10 experts. This helps us understand what are the strengths in different government agencies, what are the limitations. Usually in many countries, what we find is that the Ministry of Environment has very strong capacities when it comes to Earth observation, probably fueled by the need to report on carbon emissions and deforestation and so on. Disaster management agencies, that their strengths vary from country to country. One of the things that we, of course, do is ensure that we facilitate the access to those mechanisms that have been set up by the space community to support disaster response efforts, whether it's the International Charter, Space and Major Disasters, whether it's Copernicus Emergency Management Service or Sentinel Asia or Surveyor, but we do raise awareness and encourage national disaster management agencies to make use of these mechanisms. In a complementary fashion, of course, we also try to work and find solutions for those applications that these mechanisms may not cover, whether it's droughts or whether it's for prevention and so on. And one of our lessons learned is that, of course, we need to keep a sustained presence in countries, and we need to also look at all phases of the disaster management cycle. Next, please. A little bit on areas of cooperation and coordination, of course, where we would be very happy to work with CEOs in building strengths of institutions in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and Asia Pacific. We work with the network of 25 regional support offices in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And we basically organize conferences for participants and decision makers, where we bring together people from the space community and from the disaster management community to build those synergies. We, of course, work with other partners, particularly regional organizations dealing with disaster management, such as the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, CDEMA, or the Central American Center for Disaster Prevention, CEPRNAC, AHA in Asia, ASEAN, etc. So we do try to address not only national partners, but also engage regional partners as needed. And we benefit from the support provided by the regional centers of space science and technology education, like the one in India that Prakash just mentioned. Next, please. Some of the key recommendations. Of course, it's imperative that we address and we provide solutions for all phases of the disaster management cycle. We have to understand the strengths and limitations of our stakeholders. One of the issues that we look for is how to build solutions, sustainable solutions, on the basis of resources that already exist in countries as well. We need to be ready to repeat the exercises. I think already Sergio Camacho mentioned one of the challenges in developing countries with frequent changes in staff. So we have to be able to go back to countries. And as I say, more and more we think that cloud-based solutions are an interesting opportunity to address those challenges in internet bandwidth. But of course, these solutions, we have to find also how people in developing countries who may not necessarily speak English, how they can make use of those solutions. The next one. And I think that's about it. Well, thank you, Erin.
Thank you very much, Juan Carlos. That was really interesting. And I'm sure you're going to get some specific questions about your work on the ground and the kinds of how you manage the partnerships at the national level and through your missions, and just a little bit more perhaps around how you organize your approach to those different areas of flood support that you mentioned. So I'm sure you'll have some questions on that and when we finish. So thank you very much. That was a great presentation on Spider. Guy, let me turn it over to you to talk a little bit about the CS working group on disasters and what you're doing around flooding these days.
Yes, great. Thank you, Erin. And thanks for inviting me. I'm glad to be here. This is my first time with this working group, so I'm very excited. I hope I can outline a little bit what we do at the CS Flood Pilot, Working Group Disasters, but I don't have any slides, so you can just sit back and listen to me or not. Anyway, so my name is Guy Schumann. I'm a co-lead of the Working Group Disasters on the Flood Pilot. Along with me are a lot of colleagues from NASA doing that pilot as well. So we have about 5 different groups that work around the world on flood issues, mostly on flood response and flood risk, using Earth observation and models. Also looking into early warning and more catchment-based solutions, maybe more hydrology-focused. So we have essentially groups in Israel, looking at India case studies. We have CONAIE, so the Argentinian Space Activity Commission. We have the Luxembourg Institute of Science and Technology looking into daily flood mapping from Sentinel-1 in Myanmar. We have the Athens National Observatory looking into floods in Balkans and in Greece. We have actually the Chinese Academy of Sciences looking into flood events in China using their satellite assets as well as open access ones from NASA and ESA. So I hope I didn't forget anyone. Oh, most importantly, actually, we have I did forget, we have the Canadians looking at the Red River of the North with their RadarSat 2 constellations, which is very exciting. And to bring this all together, as you now heard, it's a lot of international case studies, a lot of international people. We are leveraging the WGCS Earth Analytics Interoperability Lab. So WGCS, for those of you who don't know, it's also a CEO's working group on information systems and services, I believe, is the right acronym. So WGCS. They have built this cloud platform where people can share data, analysis-ready data, and also have their codes and using Jupyter notebooks, as was mentioned before. So this is a good exercise, we believe, for us in the flood pilot to bring together all the different players, use data sharing, and also hopefully run some algorithms on that platform. And this is probably what we would do in capacity building in this flood pilot. We use that platform to also have restricted access, because some data are very non-public data sets. So this also gives us a way to restrict access to certain groups within the flood pilot, which is very much welcomed by a lot of our team members. Other things related to capacity building. I heard that before Prakash mentioned the MOOCs. With my European hat on flooding, I'm also involved in a larger European MOOC project on showing the latest in European tools for flood inundation mapping on Sentinel-1. Just wanted to note that I'm a person with many hats, so I'm active in Europe and the US. But the common thread is, I guess, flooding. And I also, in my free time, am advising the UN WFP emergency GIS team on flood modeling and remote sensing of floods. So there I learn a lot of capacity building stuff, and it's a real eye opener sometimes. So I would say, in terms of maybe things that we don't do enough in the flood pilot, is actually related to capacity building, but that's also, I believe, not so much the goal of the flood pilot itself. It's more looking into data sharing and using other non-public data sets, making sure the agencies can release those data sets for looking at new scientific areas into processing those data sets, like, for instance, Cosmos SkyMet, or what I was mentioning before, the Canadian RadarSat 2, which we're actually very glad will be shared among the flood pilot people to build the algorithms with that data set and see what they can do. So that's very exciting. Other things maybe relevant to this is that as I said, there are many international teams involved, so a lot of these teams work directly with certain end users. But I think it take me a bit too long to go into what each one of them does with their end user groups, but they do connect to end users directly, and we encourage them also to their case studies to make them more relevant to real world applications rather than scientific analysis. But the flood pilot is primarily looking at how to advance flood risk monitoring and mapping with new data sets and new algorithms. So I hope that gave you a good introduction. I'm happy to answer any questions, or you can also find me on LinkedIn or on my email. So happy to answer questions over email as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Guy. Thank you very much. That was a great overview. It sounds like you're busy, I have to say. Got a lot going on.
I mean, floods are keeping me busy, so
yeah.
Unfortunately.
I think, the forecasts are for floods to keep all of us busy in most parts of the world in the decades ahead. So,
yes, unfortunately, very true.
I think none of you will be sleeping much in the decades ahead if things go the way they're forecast to go. One thing I'm curious about, one of the aims of our work here during this annual meeting is to really kind of drill down into flooding and to think specifically about the role that WGCapD can play in supporting capacity development in this area. So we're really trying to keep things kind of practical. So I'd like to, before I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience in a few minutes, but I'd like to ask all three of you the difficult question of where are we falling short? Like where are the gaps, or where are the needs that are not being met now that you see that, is something that we should be working together as a community of practice, or something you see that WGCapD can be doing specifically? Where is the opportunity and the need right now? Juan Carlos, can I start out with you? Do you have an idea?
I think that there are a lot of capacities and a lot of knowledge in the working group that could help CEOs. It could help GEO, could help us, could help other organizations in doing that capacity building effort. So it might be interesting to share lessons learned, but also that knowledge from the working group. As I mentioned, we would also look forward to synergies with the working group to see how we can strengthen the efforts we do in capacity building, looking at floods. With respect to Guy, I would say that one of the challenges we find, of course, is how do we develop solutions when radar imagery is not yet capable of mapping floods in urban areas because of the double bounce back. This is a question that we're going to pose to the working group on the flood pilot. It will probably be a combination of radar imagery in the neighborhood of urban areas, and then maybe hydrological modeling or at least pitched elevation models, but so that we can tell disaster management agencies that also urban areas are flooded, because we're not really able to pick that up from radar imagery. Of course, if it's not cloudy, we can see it with optical imagery, but in tropical countries, usually when you have a flood, it's very cloudy. It might take days before you can get an optical image. So this is something that we're elevating to the CEO's working group on flood pilot and the work group on disasters. And then, of course, how to go about capacity building and those solutions so that those professionals in developing countries that we're training, they can make use of these solutions.
So, Juan Carlos, I do take this with a lot of passion, actually. So to say, your suggestion or recommendation that we look into the urban flooding, and actually the one team I was mentioning working on Myanmar and Sentinel-1 is actually, they're actually looking at finalizing part of the algorithm to do urban flood mapping based on the coherence from Sentinel-1. So not intensity, since as you said, you get a lot of the double bounds and it's really difficult, but they look at the coherence change through time with the Sentinel-1. So if you have an unflooded urban area and then a flooded urban area, there will be change in the signal, and then they relate that change to flooding. So that could be, I mean, this algorithm also NASA JPL uses it, this method, but it's in its infancy. It's at the beginning. You're very right that urban flood mapping, when it's cloudy, when there's no high resolution commercial optical imagery, and it's still very, very difficult, and we may be a bit away from operational, but we're getting there slowly. But I do suggest that to the flood pilot, that we look into this a bit more in detail. Yeah. Very, very, very interesting.
I would like to also, come over here, especially for urban floods. As Guy told, it's good to use coherence-based, projects where the surfaces are changed drastically before the floods and after the floods. Another interesting thing which is developing, especially in context of urban flooding, is the use of the UAV technology and the drones, because it's difficult to operate drones in rural areas, but definitely in urban areas, a lot of people are now using high resolution optical imaging, and since you operate from low altitude, the clouds are also not a hindrance in that case, and that provides you a very fast, quick assessment about the spatial distribution of floods. So that's probably supplements the remote sensing, space-based remote sensing observations.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those excellent suggestions. Well, I'll contact you later on.
Thank you.
Anything else you'd like to add? Any of the presenters in this general topic about needs? And Guy or Prakash, anything else you'd like to add there about what you see as needs that are or opportunities that we could be seizing?
I mean,
yeah. Sorry.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. So what I was trying to mention is that one of the the major gap area in terms of the requirements of the policymakers and those who are working on ground at the time of floods is availability of radar observations from space. Still, we don't have, even though you have, you invoke charter and you start collecting data from multiple satellites, still at the time of emergency and still at the time of disaster, you will be always falling short of having, timely data sets. Which is very important. First few hours of disaster, if you do not get the timely data, that becomes a big gap. So in terms of WGCapD, we not only are here for training, but we are also here for data democracy and data sharing. So I think the space agencies in the world needs to step up their efforts for launching more microwave high resolution satellite systems so that the turnaround of getting the microwave data from space during disaster, especially the flood disaster situation, can be minimized. Another thing we can think of, now high resolution, even optical data sets from geostationary platforms are also becoming more and more popular. So in case whenever you don't have this microwave data in quick turnaround fashion, maybe we need to develop methodology how we can make use of high resolution optical images from geostationary platform. So this is the major gap area. And then of course, in terms of, telling about the products and services to the planners, but I think that can be handled. In my view, the biggest challenge is to provide timely data about and within the stipulated time as and when the disaster happens. Thank you.
Guy, I think you wanted to add on there.
Yeah, I think it was mentioned by Juan Carlos before, actually, but I really want to emphasize this because I think this working group, so the CAP working group, where it could help is maybe a way to pool all these capacities that exist within other working group in CEOS. Because I'm sure it's full of capabilities, but also capacity building efforts in other groups, and I think it'd be nice to pull in, make a pool of all these things, maybe thematic related. So have one for floods, one for other things, but maybe almost like a list of capabilities and capacity building activities that is available within the wider CEOS. I don't know if that's a lot of work or if the individual working groups can do that, and then it's just somebody pulling that information together. But I think there's a lot of knowledge available that each one of us has, but nobody knows what the overall capabilities are. It's sometimes very difficult. And I think end users would welcome that too. Just a suggestion.
Yeah. I'll put that back to the group and see if you have any thoughts that you want to add into the chat on that point. Sergio, did you want to ask a question? Oh, sorry, your mic you're muted. You're having problems with your sound? Okay, while you're working on that, I have another question that's in the chat that came from Emil Charrington at NASA, for particularly for Juan Carlos, asking you to speak about the capacity building implications of UN Spider's decade plus of doing technical advisory missions around the globe.
Yeah, we've done a little bit over 40 advisory missions to different developing countries since 2008. And of course, the lessons learned vary from country to country, in some cases from continent to continent. In some countries, there are more advances. In other countries, there are less advances. In the context of disaster management, some of the agencies have a very good working relationship with partner institutions. In addition to the Met Department, other institutions that generate information, whether it's on floods or landslides or volcanic activity or earthquakes. In other cases, this is more limited, so we try to bridge those institutions. One of the things that we do try to do, we think it's important, is that in some countries, there may be capacities in some ministries. So we try to build on the notion of technical interinstitutional teams as a way to enhance the capacity to use space-based information in floods that would be useful for disaster management agencies, in droughts that would be useful for the ministries of agriculture and food security commissions, in case of forest fires, that's more useful for the ministries of environment, or in case of harmful algae blooms, in case of ministries of health. So we think that it's important to bring people from different sectors of development, technical people, to work together. They're able to really then share a lot more data and come up with better maps of what's happening on the ground on the basis of satellite imagery and their own in situ data. And as I think that the lesson learned is there are different ways of addressing disaster management. Those countries where disasters are very frequent, of course, they have better capacity, they dedicate more resources. Those countries where disasters are rare, they may not necessarily have the strongest of disaster management agencies.
Great, thank you. Sergio, how's your sound coming along? Oh, unfortunately, we're still not hearing you. Well, here's a question from David Green that we can take in the interim. That sounds like it'll be a good question for the group. It's about the gap associated with DEMS and capacity to inform flood depth, and what can WGCapD do to help with this issue? Guy, Guy want to jump in with a response on that?
It's not bad. So I could maybe take the liberty, to talk for this group. But I think one way, David, maybe thinking about this is that a lot of the difficulties in getting better DEMs and better digital elevation models around the globe is maybe linked to the fact that there is a lot of technology existing and a lot of capability and capacity to do that. But it's very hard to pull all these things together and get an open access digital elevation model. So maybe one way of doing this is for this group to look into options or possibilities. This may be, maybe the start of building a community of digital elevation model around the globe using CEOS and this working group as a vehicle for that. That'd be my suggestion. Again, I don't know how much effort that is. It sounds like some effort, but it also within CEOS, I think it's the right starting point maybe to get this looked at. It's a very big issue not having a high resolution open access digital elevation model globally. It's a huge gap.
Go ahead, Prakash and Juan Carlos. I can see you're both nodding. Prakash, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, I think it's a very important question, which is especially about the digital elevation models, and especially areas where often flood happens. The digital elevation model also needs updation, because of the previous floods. You will find that the older DEMs are not going to work, and large amount of modification in the geomorphology in the river basin happens. So I think quick updation on them is required. And in terms of capacity building, our WGCapD, I think we need to start having some training programs on photogrammetry, which of late I'm not seeing much efforts on that direction. So that wherever possible, wherever we have the overlapping satellite pairs, there should be a capacity at the user level to develop digital elevation models in a quick turnaround time manner, considering the dynamics of the region where floods often occur. So there is a need of continuous updation as well as training for on the broad field of photogrammetry to generate digital elevation models. And WGCapD can help over there.
I would like to launch a request.
Please.
Sometimes when we go to developing countries, some people think that the only useful satellite imagery is the high resolution that I have from the last hour. Everything else is kind of useless. We do try to encourage and to look for solutions that give us the combination of archived and up-to-date imagery. And drought is a fantastic way to do that. With the MODIS imagery, we can answer how severe is a current drought in comparison to droughts in the last 20 years. Is the current drought more severe or less severe than droughts in the last 20 years? For that, we benefit from having the archived imagery. Fantastic. The other challenge we have is at times there's value to having moderate, high resolution and lower resolution imagery. And this is the request. How do we come up with a suggestion on how people should make use of these images at different resolutions? Because they also contain a lot of very useful information. How do we build a very nice application that says, this is the broader way to look at whether it's floods or droughts or landslides or integrated risk management, if we combine the strengths of satellite imagery at different resolutions. Because often, as I say, the view is it's like a beautiful color photograph from 400 kilometers above, and the one I need is high resolution right now. And there's value into that archived, and there's value into the different resolutions, but we need to find and convey the solutions to the people.
Well, that's an interesting point to end on. I want to just perhaps as our last question to the panel, I want to flip it back in the other direction about how do you manage the needs bubbling up? Sylvia in the last session talked a little bit about the Santa Claus list that a country may have and may shop around to donors. But from you and USA, what are you doing, or what are some of the lessons you've learned rather about listening to users and being able to take action on what users see as their needs and their priorities?
I would say that the younger generation that we meet in developing countries who have some skills in remote sensing and GIS, they also want to generate a lot of information. So they look forward to the trainings so that they can generate relevant information for their institutions. Everybody has, we need young people, very talented people that want to do that. And I think they would welcome very much novel solutions that they can implement on the ground, whether it's cloud-based or software-based solutions. Fantastic, but that's one of the things we look at. I think the other issue is, as I say, there are different needs. More and more we see this issue of climate change. Let's try to bring that part. Yeah, how do we go about showing what's going to be the impact of more frequent and more intense floods? How do we convey that message to decision makers? Of course, it might be hydrological modeling with DEMs and looking at what's the change in land use over years to try to show trends and more frequent, more intense floods related to climate change.
Great, thank you. That's helpful. I think we're just about out of time. We need to move on to our breakout groups, which I think will be, hopefully will carry the conversation on there. And I'm sure people who've been participating all morning will have a lot of ideas. And I know we have a lot of flood specialists on the call as well. So we're looking forward to hearing inputs from those. I'll explain the breakout groups in just one second, but I wanted to give you a chance. All of you, do you have one last word of advice or one last parting thought you'd like to share with the group as we close out?
I would probably say there's great strength in SEALs. We have to raise awareness about that.
Great, thank you. Guy or Prakash, want to jump in there?
I don't know if I have any closing remarks or a good a good suggestion or recommendation, but I think we need to really continue to working together globally on finding really good solutions for responding to flood events most efficiently, because it's getting to a stage where everybody is really looking at Earth observation. I can see that 20 years ago, very few mandated agencies not to do with Earth observation were looking into Earth observation as a solution for flood response. Now it's almost like completely 360, like completely like 180 degree change. It's completely different now. So I think we need to step up and really work together on a common solution for Earth observation based flood response. And of course that should remain as much free as possible. So I know a lot of efforts mean a lot of money and somebody needs to pay, but yeah, for response, I think it's important to remain that as much as freely available as possible.
Yeah. Yeah, we need to find the solution and present it to them. Prakash, go ahead. Last word.
Yeah, I think today's discussions was very encouraging, and I hope that CEOS and our CEOS WGCapD has a lot of potential. There are a lot of expertise in this group, especially in terms of technical tools, and we need to create more awareness, especially as told by Sean among the younger generation, and so that the awareness about the climate mitigation, floods, and many other natural hazards will be there. It's our ability to cope up with the situation and to have an appropriate response. If we create more awareness as well as develop more tools to provide information to the society, I think that's where we can chip in, and that is where I think we should think about in future, that how we can help societies in combat. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Those are great thoughts to end this portion of the session on. I think the points about cooperation, collaboration, mobilizing the resources we have, that goes back to Barb's point about building on what we already have. And then this thread too about literacy and education and persuading a lot of different audiences about the importance and the value and the opportunity of the work that you're all doing. Those are tasks for all of us, and certainly something I think that WGCapD will be very interested in going forward.